This video contains major spoilers for God of War Ragnarok, including the true ending, everything up until the actual scrolling credits. Do not watch this video unless you finish the game or for whatever reason don't care about spoilers. Before God of War Ragnarok actually came out, I feel like the general outlook on it was, what do we gotta be worried about? They got this in the bag, easy money. And when reviews came out and they were positive, people said, yeah, duh, of course it's great, there was no doubt in my mind. But if you really sit and think about it, it was dealt a bit of a tough hand. Here it is trying to be the conclusion of a duology that at one point was meant to be a trilogy, and following up a game that teased the death of its main character and Ragnarok, all while hardly building up the Norse mythos itself, being a much more focused narrative on less characters. Ragnarok also didn't have the benefit of being a bold new direction for the franchise, and was being asked to pay off this new series while continuing to connect itself to the original series and of course standing out as its own complete product. I would argue that there are about 106 ways from Sunday that Ragnarok could upset a large portion of its player base, and hell, even now I've seen a surprising amount of people online saying it didn't deliver or had a mediocre ending, but in the face of being asked to simultaneously continue the intimate storytelling of 2018 and to deliver on the decidedly not intimate end of the world storyline with dozens of new characters, God of War Ragnarok did something really interesting. Instead of tossing in a bunch of characters with disparate personal arcs amidst an overshadowing apocalypse plot, this entire 25 to 50 hour game takes one single concept and grabs it, flips it, twists it, pull it, push it, pass it, bop it. Onto every participating member, onto the overarching narrative structure, and onto its concept of prophecy itself. Nature versus form is the cornerstone of Kratos' arc in this game, a great continuation of what began in 2018, where he struggled with acknowledging his own past in any way or explaining his true nature to his own son. And it was also an idea present in Atreus' personal journey in that game, where he became the most terrifying adversary in the series, a moody 11-year-old. In that game though, Kratos still falls back to his old ways. He gives Baldur's Neck the old Yankee Doodle twist, and in this game, well, I don't really need to spell it out for you, it's made pretty obvious. He mentions it a bunch, the other characters mention it a bunch, arguably a little bit too much, but it's pretty straightforward. This man is trying to be better and find new solutions to conflict. But what I find the most interesting about this idea here is how it basically summarizes what happens to every single character in this game, not always in the exact same way. They can't all be Fenrir's nature literally taking over the form of Garm, but every single person basically ends up rejecting what's expected of them for better or for worse. Let's start with the biggest one first. I've seen some complaints from people around this mask, asking what the point of it was. Why did they never tell us what's behind this tear? We spend so long getting this mask, and then Atreus just snaps it in the end. What an asshole. It felt like it had a bigger role in the ending and they just cut it. Some people think it might even be grounds for DLC, and my rebuttal to that is, what? Odin, what are your thoughts?
What was it all for?
Good question. I feel like most people did pick up on this, but snapping the mask and never knowing what's behind the tear is the whole point. It's not a plot point that they couldn't get to, it's not another MacGuffin that they decided to then leave on the cutting room floor, and it's not something that they need to explore further. I mean, they could if they wanted to, but for the purposes of this game's narrative, seeing what the tear is all about would completely contradict its main themes. In this game, we see a lot more of Atreus and Kratos on their own little adventures, and it gives us a better insight of how they operate without each other, and in turn, it also really accentuates what makes them such a perfect blend together. Kratos will always make the less risky decision nowadays. He will always make the right choice for him and his son directly, so Atreus can seem like a bit of a twerp when he's trying to pull all these risky moves or arguing with his dad, but on his own it becomes apparent that while he makes a lot of dumb decisions at times, he has the ability to make things better instead of just maintaining the status quo. He's not okay with just surviving, he wants to step in and fix what's broken. That's why I think it's so important that Sony Santa Monica has already established in this game that both Kratos and Atreus going forward are effectively going to store each other's personalities and opinions in the back of their heads, and that way they can make more balanced decisions even as they go their separate ways. Considering what they set up for Kratos in the future, he's gonna need Atreus' guidance in some way to make that happen. While Atreus does his best to improve things though, he's proactive to a fault. He always wants things to happen, a lot like Loki in Norse mythology. He would do stuff like cut off Sif's hair despite knowing it would get him in serious trouble, or promise Frigg's hand in marriage, or his own head on a spike as a reward for certain deeds just to see something eventful. Atreus shares a lot of those same traits. He's curious, obsessive, and antsy, so for him to not only destroy the ultimate source of knowledge, but to do so after it was him who cracked the code and found every part of it, is a rejection of how he's been until this point, on top of the lessons that he learned about about how
there's always a choice!
Despite how reliant he was on Groa's prophecy early on. If he looks into the tear, every lesson Kratos tried to teach him over the game, all the character growth that we're working towards, and the game's overall commentary on choice disappears in an instant. Here's a thing that gives you all of the answers, it gives you whatever you want, but it denies you of actual experiences. Do you look into it or not? Honestly, the more I think about it, the funnier it is to me that the whole game everyone's telling you not to fall for Odin's manipulations, he'll sweet talk you into whatever he needs for his endless pursuit of knowledge, and then Atreus goes to Odin and you're thinking the whole time, well, don't trust him, what are you doing? And then somehow people are getting upset that you didn't do the thing that he wanted you to do in the end? Like, let me get this clear, the dangerous obsession that consumed Odin's entire being, that's the route you wanted this kid to take?
Okay.
But it's not just him and Kratos whose arcs are tied to this central theme. Let's talk about the other giants in the room for a sec. Faye and Angrboda are both from a culture that is not only beholden to prophecy, but are the bearers of that foresight, and yet they both outwardly reject that form in this game. Every story with a prophecy handles it a little bit differently. Some completely subvert your expectations on who's at its center, some rely on its incompletion to give a little bit of wiggle room, but in God of War, prophecy becomes glorified estimation, as the Norns reveal to Kratos that they're just sort of good at guessing. And the more predictable you are, the more you adhere to the same things you've always done, the more accurate prophecy becomes. Effectively, to truly pull away from your scrutable form is to truly fly in the face of that estimation. Not only are the character arcs that we see in this game then a direct explanation for why things didn't go as foretold, but Faye introduced even more random variables by betraying the rules of her people and giving her family only half of a prophecy on purpose. Angrboda kinda does the same thing as we see that shift on screen. At first, she's even more stuck on prophecy than Atreus is. It's all she knows. She refuses to even be part of the story at first, which would have made my roommate really happy because after the Ironwood section where you grab a bunch of paint supplies for half an hour, he said, and I quote, "I never want to see Angrboda ever again in my life, but lucky for us and unlucky for him, she does come back, and like Faye, like everyone, decides to reject what she's supposed to be. Her intervention into this whole process is the reason they escape, but more importantly, she may actually be responsible for both of our characters' future through direct intervention." A detail that I've seen floating around online is that the final image on Kratos' shrine seemed fresher and used a different paint and style than the rest, looking awfully similar to Angrboda's paintings in Ironwood, and considering she says this,
I decided it would be better if I wrote the ending myself.
I think it's fair to assume that she's responsible for setting Kratos on this new path, one which, considering her arc in this game and how the entire franchise treats prophecy as a whole, she may not have even seen in a dream or anything and just wanted him to see as an option to spur on his journey to peace. Then there's Freya, another obvious one, but her thoughts of vengeance towards Kratos and Odin as well as her rejection of the Asgard part of her.
I never thought I'd have the pleasure of seeing you again, Frigg.
Don't call me that. I haven't been that person in a long time.
Are the main things that drive everything she does. But not only is her eventual acceptance of her time in Asgard the reason she's able to tap into her true power during her own little quest, but she eventually, along with Atreus and Kratos, accepts that vengeance won't give her peace, and in the end, it's Sindri, the meekest, kindest little dude for most of these games, that comes in with bloodshot eyes to finish the job. And talk about portraying this whole theme in a completely different way. As interesting as it is to go back through the game and see hints of Tyr being Odin in disguise, I find it even more interesting to pick up on the things Sindri says throughout the game as he gets pushed around and accepts it.
Although, these are gifts I'm giving to you, so I shouldn't be sorry and you should be thankful.
I promised him some food and a room to rest in.
Ah, of course you did.
I mean, look how bummed he is that Draupnir, which was so important to the Halder brothers' work, is just being given away. He wasn't kidding when he said we just took and took with no regard for what he wanted, and despite being a giving and caring person for so much of this series, he ends the game as one of the most hateful things left in the Nine Realms. Now what about Brock? Considering Kratos literally says the theme of this game directly to Brock, you might think that it's a bit cut and dry, but while that moment focuses on how Brock is more than just some soulless husk, that's not the full extent of his arc. Not only does he actively make selfless decisions despite his outwardly gruff and agitated demeanor, for example, he was the one to suggest giving away Draupnir in the first place without a moment's hesitation, but he's also the one to piece together what nobody else in this room could. Despite not acting like your typical super genius, he's the only one to notice something's wrong. Despite not being the picture of kindness, he willingly sacrifices his possessions for the good of the world, and despite being half dead, he's the only reason everyone else lives. Even on Asgard's side, Sif eventually turns on Odin, and Thor, who has so many parallels to Kratos, rejects his form as a killing machine in the end, as a vengeful god with no other option. Where have I seen that before?
You don't talk! You don't think! I think you kill! Take the hammer and kill who I tell you to kill!
I am your monster no longer.
He decides to stop fighting Kratos despite us constantly butting heads at this point, and the only people that refuse to change, Odin and Heimdall, end up as the two real losers of the game. At least Thor maintained the respect of his family after his final choice. Even Thrud, while she doesn't undergo as much change in the game and has a more traditional arc, she's the daughter of Thor and granddaughter of Odin. You'd expect her to be a certain way, but she's pretty damn chill when she's not trying to stab us, although, just a side note real quick, somebody lock up the people on r/God of War. What are you guys doing over there? I'm pretty sure that's a child. Kirby's calling the police. This idea of nature versus form is spread out evenly throughout the entire game and imposed onto nearly every character, and while that sometimes means that the game overstates the obvious here and there, it's also the reason that such a massive plot can have such a grounded feel. One thing I do think the game struggles with though is its allocation of time. I won't say it has a pacing problem, but it's got some noticeable pacing issues. Sony Santa Monica has relied pretty heavily on MacGuffins and princesses in another castle over these Norse games. I actually have a bigger problem with it in 2018 because the items or goals often felt divorced from the characters and were just things you had to go get or do because the plot said so. Here, most of your jumping around is based on trying to solve personal issues or be a catalyst to prophecy or procure tools that have a direct impact on how you play, which is definitely better, but there were still a lot of moments in that first half that felt like they took way too long to matter. Back to back to back, Santa Monica plants the seeds for something, but then makes it kind of feel useless at the time. Some of this stuff definitely could have been redirected to other characters, like honestly, either cut Skildir or give him more screen time, because he had a good base for a character, but I didn't care about him because he shows up for 0.2% of the game's main story before the final battle. Yes, that's the actual number, I checked his screen time. Also, stuff like Sif's change of heart feels very random. In one scene we see her beg the Allfather and Thor to blast Atreus into next Tuesday, and in the very next scene she shows up in, she's telling Thrud how they hate Odin now, and Atreus, who is still involved in her son's death, is totally fine in her books. I could see the beginnings of her hatred of Odin for sure, but her forgiveness of Atreus was completely out of left field, especially the way she pops out from behind this pillar like some sort of Elena ex machina. I don't know, her character felt very incomplete, as did Freya's transition in the middle of the game. She seems all too okay with Kratos after you fight Nidhogg. There's not even a tinge of resentment from her despite saying this right after the fight.
There's still a part of me that is so angry. And it'll always be angry.
Considering she's constantly landing digs and undermining Mimir for selling her to Odin throughout the rest of the game, I feel like it's a little bit weird that she never has jabs she throws at Kratos going forward. Just a couple of lines here and there of her still holding on to the hate that she says she still has would go a long way, show her inner turmoil a bit. She should be accepting things, not having already accepted them, but they're like best friends after this. It doesn't help that her hint dialogue, which I complained about in this other video, is the most condescending and robotic out of the main cast. Danielle Basutti is a great actress in emotional scenes, but during gameplay when she's likely just saying lines in a booth, she sort of sounds like Siri. And tossing in those lines in the middle of this mission where she's starting the process of forgiving Kratos gives off a weird mixed energy, like she's violently shaking back and forth between anger and perfect calm and helpfulness. Not like she's struggling with how to react, more like she's got two completely different personalities. While a couple of moments were bumpy along the way though, I think the third act paid off everything exactly as it needed to, and I really reject this idea that the ending wasn't epic enough, which is another big criticism that I've seen going around. First things first, some of the things I've seen people say they were expecting are crazy. Apparently this battle is too small scale and it should have been this huge army that you raise yourself as you fight through 17 mini-bosses and the entire world is crumbling around. I think people are forgetting the limitations of games. As raucous and massive as the original trilogy got, it was still in a contained space. The Poseidon fight is wild, for instance, and probably the best example of how nuts this series gets, but one massive set-piece fight is different from a war with a full army, giants and gods fighting on all sides, all with this over-the-shoulder camera angle and this level of fidelity. That's just not feasible to execute. Name any video game battle that from a cinematography perspective felt more grand and epic than this one. Maybe a few have a bigger scale and concept, but not with this level of execution, not even close. I thought the final battle in Ragnarok was pretty damn cool. It felt so visceral and personal. It flipped the perspectives and weaved characters we care about in and out of the shot, and then you looked up and Jormungandr's fighting Thor, a giant Surtur is being bombarded with projectiles, you had explosions, transformations, character moments, dive bombing Thor. It was awesome. But even that aside, I also think there's a fundamental misunderstanding that some people have of the concept of Ragnarok in Norse mythology. The original story of Ragnarok was actually told in just 18 stanzas. The rest of the poem around it was just describing the aftermath. Later poems added things here and there, but not much. And for reference, I've quintupled the amount of words of those 18 stanzas in this video already. The point is, it's certifiably tiny, and you'll notice that wherever it pops its head, it feels like a bit of an afterthought. In Neil Gaiman's retelling of the Norse myths, for example, he spends almost the same amount of time explaining how Frey is down bad as he does recounting the entire story of Ragnarok. And even in that section, Ragnarok itself is sped through as Gaiman highlights the greater importance of the new beginning it's meant to usher in. Hell, even the MCU's Ragnarok is a last-minute Hail Mary in the final minutes of that film. Until that point, the movie's about completely different things. Ragnarok is an immovable point in time and the end of things as we know it, yet it's more important as a concept than an actual event. So to have it as the bow tie, the sideshow here, is kind of appropriate, especially considering what this new series has always been about. What matters are these characters' journeys and their own personal conflicts. If you sacrifice the event for character growth, that's a sacrifice I'm more than okay with. I would 1,000 times over want to see this scene that perfectly encapsulates where these four characters are at the end of the game than to see Fenrir take a big bite out of Odin and kill him like in the myth. They totally could have done it, even just had Fenrir deliver a final blow after your personal altercation with him, but this is more appropriate for our characters. I understand wanting to see more spectacle or wanting to see every detail of the Ragnarok myth represented in some epic way, and I think they could have packed maybe a little bit more with Odin's fight, for example, but it really doesn't matter to me. In the end, after all of this talk from the main cast about Ragnarok and who's gonna lead and save them, they actually handle the real business themselves, and everything else, this big prophecy about the destruction of Asgard, is just kind of tying up loose ends. I think the narrative director of Ragnarok, Matt Sophos, put it best when he said of the mythology, the more we started to focus on that, the more we kept going, we're off the path. As you're developing a story, especially one as big as this one, and you know you're gonna have to deal with Ragnarok, we could see every time that we were starting to veer off too much of the prophecy and mythology lane and needed to bring it back to the personal. I think that was the right call, honestly, and it tied everything together really beautifully. It's pretty obvious that this isn't the last we'll see of Loki. I think it's basically a guarantee that he'll get his own mini spin-off a la Miles Morales or Lost Legacy, not a full game, but his own smaller continuation. There's way too many story threads to still tie up to not have that happen. They even mention the vacancy of the ruler of Hell, which alludes to the only one of Loki's children that he didn't create in this game. Although my other big complaint with the narrative is that I wish it felt more final. Calling it the end of the Norse saga and then having massive questions left over, some tied directly to the Norse side of things, felt a little bit off. I would have liked to see most things wrapped up, maybe allude to Kratos' future a little bit, and then any connections back to the series you could make once you created the next installment. It's still not something that ruined the story by any means, but it's a little bit annoying. Atreus' presence is sorely missed in the endgame, which I think is 1,000% intentional. Their absence from each other's lives is something that we can feel as players, and that sets up a really cool future for this franchise. There's so many places it could go, and Sony Santa Monica has proven that they're able to adapt really well after not only reinventing this series last time, but then managing to blow up its scale tenfold and still keep its core human story intact through it all this time. I'm sure I'll make a video about the gameplay side of things at some point, who knows when, but narratively, in my opinion, it delivered on basically all fronts, and I couldn't have asked for a better product. Except for the horn thing. You probably should have told me the horn thing.